He was one of the richest men in the country, a titan of technology whose innovations had reshaped the digital landscape, but Julian Vance knew the bitter taste of powerlessness. No amount of money, no army of specialists, no fortress of a mansion overlooking the Pacific could fix the central silent tragedy of his life, his son. Leo, at 5 years old, was a ghost in his own home, and for 3 years, ever since his mother's death, no nanny, no nurse, no caregiver had lasted more than a few months. They all succumbed to the same oppressive silence, the same heartbreaking futility. They would quit, defeated by a small boy who never spoke, never made eye contact, and who resisted every attempt at connection with a rigid, unyielding stillness. Most unnerving of all was how he slept, propped upright in a corner of his custom-made bed, surrounded by a fortress of pillows, as if lying down was a terror he could not face. After firing the 7th specialist nanny, a woman with a string of degrees and a colder heart than his own, Julian was at his breaking point. His desperation was a raw, open wound. But then a woman named Clara Mayhew showed up for an interview. She was not a specialist. She had no advanced degrees. She was a housekeeper with a quiet demeanor and eyes that held a profound, settled sadness that Julian recognized, for it was a mirror of his own. He was about to dismiss her when he saw something in her application, a gap in her employment history that coincided with the same years his own life had shattered. He hired her on a whim, a final desperate roll of the dice. What he didn't know was that Clara's quietness was not emptiness, but a vessel of fierce observation. She didn't try to engage Leo with loud toys or forced cheerfulness. She simply cleaned, her movements fluid and silent, and she watched. Days turned into weeks. Julian saw no change, and his hope began to curdle back into familiar despair. He had decided to let her go, to admit this final failure. But one Tuesday, a business meeting was canceled, and he returned home hours earlier than usual. The house was silent, as always. He walked towards Leo's playroom, the resignation heavy in his chest, preparing the words of dismissal for Clara. As he reached the doorway, he stopped. The sight that greeted him froze him in place, shattering his understanding of his own son and setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel a devastating secret. For there on the floor sat Clara, her back to the door, a small bowl of water between her and his son. And Leo, his rigid, unreachable son, had his small hand dipped in the water, his fingers gently tracing Clara's as she guided them through a slow, silent dance. It was the first time in 3 years Julian had seen his son willingly touch another human being, and in that single, impossible moment, everything changed. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Clara Mayhew understood silence. It had been her companion for the better part of 4 years, a thick, suffocating blanket she had pulled over herself after her own world had ended. She recognized the quality of the silence in the Vance mansion. It wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of held breath, of unspoken grief. It clung to the polished marble floors and the vast empty spaces between museum-quality furniture. It was the sound of a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Her duties were simple, laid out on a laminated sheet by the previous head of staff before her unceremonious departure. Maintain the home's sterile perfection, do not disturb Mr. Vance in his West Wing office, and under no circumstances attempt to engage with the child. The protocols for Leo were even more rigid, managed by a stern, rotating nurse named Helen, who administered his medication twice a day with grim efficiency. Clara was to clean his room while he was in his designated therapy sessions and ensure his meals, a bland, textureless puree, were placed on his tray at the precise times. She was a ghost hired to care for the house of a ghost, but Clara was an observer. It was a skill honed by loss, a desperate attempt to find meaning in the meaningless. She saw things the string of nannies and nurses had missed, or perhaps had not cared enough to see. She saw the way Leo's small body, always so ramrod straight, would tense infinitesimally, just before Nurse Helen entered the room with a little paper cup of pills and water. She saw how his left hand, the one that wasn't clutching a small, worn wooden horse, would twitch for a few seconds after he swallowed the medicine. The official diagnosis, a thick binder left on the kitchen counter, called it severe nonverbal autism with sensory processing disorder. It was a label, a box to put the boy in so the world could stop asking questions. But Clara had seen a different kind of locked-in state once before, and the diagnosis felt wrong, like a coat that was 2 sizes too small. Her first week was spent learning the geography of the house and its sorrow. The east wing belonged to the late Isabella Vance. It was preserved, not lived in. Dust covers draped the furniture like shrouds. The air was still, heavy with the scent of old perfume and faded potpourri. Clara was instructed not to clean in there, but one afternoon she pushed the door ajar. Sunlight streamed through a large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. On a bedside table was a silver frame holding a photo of a woman with a radiant smile, holding a chubby, laughing baby. The baby in the photo was unmistakably Leo, but he was a different child entirely, his eyes bright with mischief, his body soft and relaxed. He was everything the current Leo was not. The contrast was a physical blow. What had happened to that laughing boy? Her focus shifted from the house to the child. She began a series of quiet experiments, so subtle they would be invisible to the security cameras Julian Vance undoubtedly had monitoring every inch of his gilded cage. She started in the kitchen, her one domain of control. The prescribed diet for Leo was monotonous, designed to avoid any sensory triggers, but Clara remembered the simple joy of smell. One morning she began her shift an hour early and baked a loaf of simple sourdough bread. She used no machines, kneading the dough by hand, feeling the life in it. As the scent of baking bread began to fill the cavernous kitchen and drift into the adjoining halls, she watched. Leo was in the living room, sitting in his designated armchair, staring at a blank television screen. But as the warm, yeasty aroma reached him, his nostrils flared just once. It was a flicker of life, a crack in the facade. Emboldened, she tried again the next day. This time it was cinnamon rolls. The sweet, spicy scent was a direct contrast to the antiseptic smell that usually permeated the house. That day, Leo, while being led by the nurse from one room to another, paused for a full 2 seconds at the kitchen doorway. He didn't look in, his head didn't turn, but his feet stopped. For a boy whose movements were as automated as a robot's, it was the equivalent of a shout. Nurse Helen tugged his arm impatiently, and the moment was gone, but Clara had seen it. He was in there somewhere. She moved on to touch. The boy was surrounded by hard, smooth surfaces, marble, glass, polished wood. His clothes were soft but synthetic, chosen for their lack of texture. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway he used to travel from his room to the therapy space, Clara left a small square of deep blue velvet on the corner of a console table. She polished the table and simply forgot it there. She watched from the far end of the hall as Leo and the nurse approached. As he passed, his hand, the one not holding the wooden horse, drifted out, and his fingers brushed against the velvet for a fraction of a second. It was a ghost of a touch, so light it barely disturbed the fabric's nap, but it was contact. It was exploration. The wooden horse was the biggest clue. He held it constantly. It was old, its paint worn away in patches, its ears smoothed down by years of anxious clutching. It was his anchor. Clara noticed he held it tightest in 2 specific situations: when Nurse Helen approached with his medication, and whenever he heard his father's heavy, decisive footsteps in the hall. It wasn't a comfort object, she realized. It was a shield. The world was a threat, and the little horse was his only defense. The mystery of his sleeping posture remained the most troubling. Every night she would check on him before her shift ended. He'd be there in his bed, propped up, his head sometimes slumping forward onto his chest, but never, ever lying down. His breathing was shallow, his face pale under the dim nightlight. One night she lingered longer than usual. The house was completely still. She watched his sleeping form and saw a tremor run through his legs, a fine, high-frequency shudder that lasted only a moment. It looked like a body fighting against something, a body that could not find rest, even in sleep. It was the same tremor she'd seen in his hand after his medicine. And in that moment, a cold, terrifying hypothesis began to form in the back of her mind. A suspicion born from the darkest corner of her own past. The diagnosis wasn't just wrong. It was a lie. And the medicine wasn't a treatment. It was the cage. The days settled into a quiet rhythm of observation and subtle tests. Clara felt like an archaeologist, carefully brushing away layers of dust and neglect to find the person buried underneath. Each small reaction from Leo was a precious artifact, a piece of a puzzle she was becoming consumed with solving. She learned his silent language. A slight tensing of his jaw meant distress. A brief widening of his eyes meant surprise. The almost imperceptible softening of his shoulders meant a fleeting moment of peace. These were signals no one else seemed to notice, dismissed as involuntary tics by the team of professionals who analyzed him through charts and data points. The kitchen remained her laboratory. She moved from scents to tastes, a far riskier venture. One afternoon she prepared Leo's standard nutrient paste, but she also baked a small batch of sweet potato muffins using only natural ingredients and no processed sugar. They were soft, warm, and filled the air with a comforting scent. When Nurse Helen came to collect Leo's tray, Clara had placed one tiny crumb-sized piece of the muffin next to the bowl of gray paste. Helen didn't notice. Clara watched through the doorway as the nurse placed the tray in front of Leo and began to spoon-feed him. Leo's eyes, usually fixed on a point in the middle distance, flickered down to the tray. He saw the tiny speck of orange. He ate the paste without resistance, as always. But after the nurse had taken the tray and left, Clara saw him lean forward ever so slightly and lick the spot on the table where the crumb had been. It was a secret, a stolen moment of flavor in his tasteless world. Clara knew she was walking a dangerous line. Mr. Vance was a man who prized control above all else. His instructions had been clear, but the memory of the laughing baby in the photograph and the ghost of her own lost child spurred her on. She had to know if she was right. She had to know if there was a way to reach him. The opportunity for her most significant experiment came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Nurse Helen had a doctor's appointment and was relieved by a temporary nurse who seemed more interested in her phone than her patient. Julian Vance was in a series of back-to-back video conferences, his voice a low, authoritative murmur from the West Wing. The house was cocooned in the steady drumming of rain against the vast panes of glass. Leo was in the living room, in his usual chair. The temporary nurse had turned on the television to a garish, loud cartoon, a cacophony of noise that seemed to make Leo retreat even further into himself, his small body rigid with tension. Clara, tasked with polishing the silver in the dining room, watched him. She could see the distress in the tight line of his shoulders, in the white-knuckled grip on his wooden horse. She waited until the nurse left the room to take a phone call. This was her chance. She walked quietly into the living room and turned off the television. The sudden silence was a relief. Leo didn't move, but the frantic energy in the room dissipated. Clara didn't approach him directly. Instead, she sat on the floor about 10 feet away, making herself small and unthreatening. She didn't speak. She simply began to hum. It was a melody that lived in her bones, a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, and that she, in turn, had sung to her own son Daniel in the few precious months she'd had with him. It was a simple, haunting tune, full of gentle rises and falls, a song of safety and rest. She hummed the first verse, her eyes on the floor. Nothing. She started the second, her voice still just a soft, breathy sound. She risked a glance at Leo. His head, always locked in that forward-facing position, had tilted. It was a minuscule movement, perhaps a quarter of an inch to the left, towards the sound. It was the most profound thing she had ever seen. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through her grief. She continued to hum, letting the melody flow through her. The tension in Leo's shoulders began to dissolve. His grip on the wooden horse loosened, the first time she had ever seen his fingers unfurled from around the toy. Taking a deep breath, Clara transitioned from humming to singing, her voice barely a whisper, but clear in the quiet room. The words were about a little boat sailing home on a silver sea, about the stars watching over it, about a safe harbor waiting at the end of the journey. They were words of peace, of unconditional love. And then it happened. A sound emerged from Leo. It wasn't a word. It was a low, guttural note, a vibration deep in his chest that harmonized for a single, breathtaking second with her own voice. It was raw and unused, the sound of a voice that had been silent for years. Clara's own voice hitched, but she forced herself to continue, to hold this fragile moment in the cradle of her song. Leo's head tilted further. His eyes, which always seemed to look through people, through walls, were now focused on her. They were a deep, intelligent brown, and for the first time Clara felt truly seen by him. Then a single tear escaped from the corner of his right eye and traced a slow, clean path down his pale cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. Clara knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that it was a tear of release. It was the rain on a parched land, the first crack in the wall of a prison. In that moment, Clara Mayhew stopped being just a housekeeper. She was this boy's only hope. And she would not, could not, let him go. Julian Vance's home office was his sanctuary and his prison. A panoramic window offered a godlike view of the coastline, but he rarely looked at it. His focus was on the bank of monitors that displayed stock tickers, encrypted communications, and, most importantly, the live feeds from the dozens of cameras hidden throughout his home. He had installed them after Isabella's death, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of control in a world that had spun violently out of it. He told himself it was for Leo's safety, but he knew it was a crutch for his own anxiety. He watched the feeds with a detached, clinical eye, tracking the movements of his staff, monitoring the precise, unchanging routine of his son. It was a way to participate in his son's life without having to feel the raw agony of their broken connection. On that rainy Wednesday, he was in the middle of a tense negotiation with a German tech firm. The voices on his speakerphone were a drone in the background. His eyes were flicking across the camera feeds, as usual, when he saw the temporary nurse walk out of the living room, phone pressed to her ear. A spark of irritation flared. He was paying a fortune for round-the-clock attentive care. He was about to buzz his security chief when he saw Clara enter the frame. He watched, his irritation turning to suspicion as she turned off the television. He saw her sit on the floor. This was a breach of protocol. The staff were not to initiate contact. They were to be invisible. He unmuted the audio feed for that room, his finger hovering over the intercom button ready to reprimand her. But instead of words, he heard music, a soft, gentle humming. He watched, mesmerized, as his son, his statue-like, unreachable son, tilted his head. Julian leaned closer to the screen, his billion-dollar negotiation completely forgotten. He saw Clara begin to sing, her voice a low, soothing whisper. He saw Leo's hand relax on the wooden horse. And then he heard the sound from his son, that rough, unpracticed note of harmony. His own breath caught in his chest. It was the first sound, other than crying. he had heard Leo make since he was 2 years old. Then he saw the tear. His mind, conditioned by years of clinical reports and grim prognoses from Dr. Finch, immediately misinterpreted it. Pain. She was causing him pain. The experimental therapies were supposed to be gentle, to avoid any emotional distress. Dr. Finch had been adamant that Leo's system was too fragile for any kind of emotional stimulation. She was hurting him. The fragile hope that had flickered for a second was instantly extinguished by a tidal wave of protective rage. He slammed his hand on the desk, cutting off the German CEO mid-sentence. "The deal is off," he snarled, and clicked off the call. He stormed out of his office, his long strides eating up the marble hallway. The grief and helplessness he felt every day had found a target, and his anger was a physical force. He burst into the living room, his voice like a crack of thunder in the quiet space. "What do you think you're doing?" Clara flinched, her song cut off abruptly. Leo's entire body seized, snapping back into its rigid posture as if he'd been electrocuted. The brief magical connection was shattered. "The rules are clear," Julian bit out, advancing on her. "You do not interact with him. You are a housekeeper. You are not a therapist. You are not his mother." The last words were laced with a venom born of his own bottomless grief. Clara scrambled to her feet, her face pale. She didn't try to make excuses. She didn't cower. She met his furious gaze with an unnerving calm, her own sad eyes holding a flicker of defiance. "He was listening," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I saw him crying," Julian shot back, pointing a trembling finger at his son. "You upset him. You're causing him distress." "That wasn't a tear of distress," Clara insisted, her voice gaining strength. "That was a release. He was connecting. I know he was." It was the conviction in her voice that gave him the slightest pause. It wasn't the sound of a woman defending a mistake. It was the sound of someone stating an incontrovertible fact. He wanted to fire her on the spot, to have security escort her from the property, to seal the walls back up around his son and his grief. But Clara did something unexpected. She ignored him completely. She turned her back on her furious, powerful employer and knelt down on the floor again, several feet from Leo. Her eyes sought his. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered, her voice infused with a warmth that seemed to push back against the room's chill. And she began to hum again. The simple, haunting lullaby filled the tense silence. Julian stood, fists clenched, ready to intervene, to drag her out himself if he had to. But he stopped. Because Leo, who had been staring blankly at the wall since his father's outburst, slowly, deliberately turned his head. He bypassed Clara and looked directly at Julian. For the first time in 3 years, Leo Vance made eye contact with his father. It wasn't a fleeting glance. He held his father's gaze, and in his deep brown eyes, Julian didn't see emptiness. He saw a plea, a question, a flicker of the boy he had lost. The rage drained out of Julian as if a plug had been pulled. It left him weak, trembling, his legs unsteady. The entire foundation of his world, built on the grim certainty of his son's condition, as explained by Dr. Finch, had just been fractured. This quiet, unassuming housekeeper had, in 10 minutes, accomplished what a legion of experts had failed to do in 3 years. She had found a crack in the wall. He sank into a nearby armchair, the anger replaced by a dizzying, terrifying vertigo of hope. He looked from his son's face to Clara's. "Don't stop," he said, his voice a hoarse, broken command. "Whatever you're doing, don't stop." A fragile, unspoken alliance was forged in that moment, an alliance built on a single, impossible tear and the melody of a half-forgotten lullaby. The following days were a study in cautious transformation. The oppressive silence of the mansion was now punctuated by the soft strains of Clara's singing. Julian, abandoning his office, became a silent observer, watching from doorways, his skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before him. He watched as Clara introduced new sensory experiences. She brought in a pot of lavender, and Leo, after a day of ignoring it, leaned towards it to catch the scent. She brought in a basin of warm water with smooth river stones, and Leo, after that first breakthrough, would now spend several minutes a day trailing his fingers through it, a look of deep concentration on his face. He was like a plant that had been starved of light, slowly, tentatively unfurling his leaves to a new sun. Julian gave Clara permission to alter Leo's diet. The gray paste was replaced by soft, flavorful foods: mashed sweet potato, pureed pears with a hint of cinnamon, creamy avocado. Leo ate slowly, hesitantly at first, but he ate. The changes were small, but they were monumental. The rigidity in his limbs lessened. The twitching in his hand after his medication seemed to decrease, though it was still present. He began to make more sounds, soft hums that echoed the melodies Clara sang. He still didn't speak, but he was no longer silent. The alliance solidified when Julian, driven by a need to understand, asked Clara about her past. They sat in the vast, impersonal kitchen one evening after Leo was in his room for the night. "Why do you know how to do this?" he asked, his voice stripped of its usual corporate authority. "Where did you learn?" Clara looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "I had a son," she said, her voice quiet. "His name was Daniel. He passed away when he was 7 months old." Julian felt a pang of sympathy, the familiar ache of a fellow traveler in the land of grief. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "He was diagnosed with a severe neurological disorder," Clara continued, her eyes distant. "The doctors said he was unresponsive, that he couldn't process stimuli. They put him on a cocktail of medications. They told me he was in a vegetative state." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I knew my son. I saw little things. The way his breathing would change when I sang to him. The way his fingers would curl around mine, just for a second. The doctors told me I was imagining it, that I was a grieving mother seeing what I wanted to see." Her voice grew stronger, laced with an old, cold anger. "I fought them. I took him to another hospital, found a doctor who would listen. They did new tests. They found out he had been misdiagnosed. It wasn't a neurological disorder, it was a rare metabolic condition. The medications they had him on were actually making it worse, suppressing his system." She finally looked up at Julian, and he saw the full weight of her tragedy in her eyes. "We changed his treatment. He started to improve. He smiled. He laughed. For 2 beautiful months I had my son back." She swallowed hard. But it was too late. The damage from the original medications was too severe. His little body couldn't recover. The story hung in the air between them, a horror that resonated deeply with Julian's own fears. He now understood the source of her intuition, her fierce, quiet determination. She wasn't just guessing. She was reliving her own nightmare, but this time she was trying to change the ending. "The medication," Julian said, the words tasting like ash. "You think it's the medication." "I think it's part of it," Clara said carefully. "The way he tenses before he takes it, the twitching after, and the sleeping. Daniel couldn't lie flat either. The doctors later said one of the drugs probably caused severe vertigo. It made him feel like he was falling. It was as if a key had turned in a lock. The strange, unnerving posture that had baffled everyone for years suddenly had a potential, terrifyingly simple explanation. "Dr. Finch prescribed all of it," Julian said, his mind racing. "He's been Leo's doctor since he was born. He was Isabella's. He was a friend." The word friend sounded hollow. That night, Julian did something he hadn't done since his wife died. He went into her study. The room was a perfect, heartbreaking time capsule. Her books were on the shelves. Her favorite shawl was draped over a reading chair. With Clara standing quietly by the door, providing a silent strength he desperately needed, he opened Isabella's desk. He found what he was looking for, her journals. He started with the last one, his hands trembling as he saw her elegant script. The entries were full of love for Leo, but they were threaded with a growing, frantic worry. He found the first mention of the new treatment Dr. Finch had recommended after Leo had a bad flu at age 2. Alistair says it's experimental, but it's the best on the market for his sensory issues. A few weeks later, Leo seems more distant today. He didn't smile when I came in. Alistair says this is normal, a settling-in period for the medication. And then, the entry that made Julian's blood run cold, dated a month before Isabella's car accident. I tried to put Leo down for his nap today, and he started screaming. A terrible, panicked sound. He won't lie down. He only falls asleep if I hold him upright in the rocking chair. I told Alistair I was worried about the medication. He was very firm, told me I was being emotional, that my grief was clouding my judgment. He said if we stopped the treatment, Leo could regress permanently. I feel so trapped. He had dismissed her worries. He had been so consumed with his work, so trusting of the renowned doctor, he had told her to listen to the expert. The guilt was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He looked at Clara, his face ashen. She knew, he whispered. She knew something was wrong. Together they delved deeper. Julian used his formidable resources to get every medical file, every lab result, every clinical note associated with Leo's case. He and Clara spread the documents across the massive dining room table, a sea of paper that held the truth of his son's stolen years. Clara, guided by the painful map of her own experience, pointed out the inconsistencies. Prescriptions for drugs whose side effects directly contradicted each other, vague diagnoses that changed subtly from one report to the next. And then she found it buried in a pharmacist's report from 2 years prior. A note flagging a prescription for a powerful older generation antipsychotic called haloperidol. It was prescribed at a dosage appropriate for a full-grown man, not a 3-year-old child. Listed among its most common and severe side effects were tardive dyskinesia, extreme vertigo, and catatonic-like states. The puzzle pieces didn't just click into place, they slammed together with the force of an explosion. The silence, the rigidity, the inability to lie down. It wasn't autism. It was a drug-induced prison. Every symptom that Dr. Finch had used to justify his expensive experimental treatments was, in fact, caused by the treatments themselves. Julian stared at the name on the prescription form, signed with a confident flourish, Dr. Alistair Finch. The man he had trusted with his son's life, the man who had comforted him at his wife's funeral, had been poisoning his child day after day, year after year. The question was no longer what was wrong with Leo. The question, Julian realized with a surge of icy fury, was why. The rage that followed was unlike anything Julian had ever experienced. It was a cold, pure, and terrifyingly focused fury. The grief that had paralyzed him for 3 years was burned away, replaced by a singular, burning purpose, to understand the depth of this betrayal and to make Alistair Finch pay for it. He no longer saw a friend or a trusted physician. He saw a monster who had worn a mask of compassion while systematically destroying his family. He immediately hired a discreet but ruthless private investigation firm, the kind that catered to billionaires with problems that couldn't be solved through conventional channels. Their mandate was simple: find out everything about Dr. Alistair Finch, his finances, his professional history, his personal life, every skeleton in his closet. While the investigators began their work, Julian and Clara focused on Leo. The evidence was overwhelming, but they needed a plan. They couldn't just stop the medication. Years of such a powerful drug would have made Leo's body dependent on it. Abruptly stopping could cause seizures or a complete system shock. "We need another doctor," Clara said, her voice steady amidst Julian's storm of anger. "Someone completely outside of Finch's network, someone who will listen." Julian, using encrypted channels, reached out to a former rival in the biotech industry, a man he respected for his brilliance and integrity. He explained the situation in broad strokes. Within hours, he had a name: Dr. Eris Thorne, a pediatric neurologist at Johns Hopkins, known for taking on impossible cases and for his fierce distrust of the pharmaceutical establishment. Julian sent his private jet for Dr. Thorne. The next day, the quiet, silver-haired doctor was sitting at their dining room table, reviewing the mountain of medical files. He worked in silence for hours, his expression growing grimmer with each page he turned. Finally, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice heavy, "this is not malpractice. This is a crime scene." He confirmed their worst fears. The cocktail of drugs, particularly the haloperidol, was a chemical straitjacket. "He's not non-verbal," Dr. Thorne explained, his voice filled with a quiet anger of his own. "He's trapped. The dystonia caused by the medication makes controlled speech nearly impossible. The vertigo is so severe that lying down would feel like being thrown from a cliff. This child has been living in a state of constant, chemically induced terror." The investigators delivered their first report that evening. It was a bombshell. Dr. Finch was financially ruined. A series of disastrous investments had left him millions of dollars in debt. But the truly damning discovery was a web of shell corporations that led to a small, obscure pharmaceutical lab in Delaware. The lab's sole product was a proprietary neurological medication, custom compounded and sold at an astronomical price. The primary and perhaps only client of this lab was the Vance estate. The lab was owned through a series of legal firewalls by Dr. Alistair Finch himself. The motive was suddenly sickeningly clear. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misdiagnosis. Finch had deliberately created Leo's condition. He had taken a toddler who was likely suffering from some manageable sensory issues after a bad flu, and he had systematically medicated him into a state of severe disability. He had created a permanent patient, a cash cow to fund his lavish lifestyle and pay off his debts, billing Julian millions a year for the very poison that was imprisoning his son. The betrayal was absolute, a darkness so profound Julian could barely comprehend it. Finch had not only abused his son and lied to him, but he had gaslighted Isabella in the final, worry-filled months of her life, using her grief and trust against her. He had let her believe her son was fading away, all while he held the syringe. The full weight of his own failure crashed down on Julian. He had been so absent, so consumed by his work and then his grief, that he had let this happen right under his roof. He had handed his son over to the wolf and paid him for the privilege. "What do we do?" Julian asked Dr. Thorne, his voice raw. "We begin by freeing him," Thorne replied. He laid out a meticulous, slow-acting plan to wean Leo off the drugs, replacing them with counter-agents and therapies designed to gently coax his system back to life. It would be a long, arduous process, with risks of regression and painful withdrawal. "He will need constant, stable, and loving support," Dr. Thorne said, his eyes landing on Clara. "The connection you've already established," he said to her, "will be his most important medicine." The plan was set. They would begin the detox process in secret, under Dr. Thorne's remote supervision. Once Leo was stable, and they had gathered more evidence, Julian would destroy Alistair Finch. But Finch, feeling the ground shift beneath him, was about to make a move of his own. The monster they were hunting was about to bite back. The first move in their silent war was to fire Nurse Helen. Julian did it himself, giving her a generous severance package, but making it clear her services were no longer required, effective immediately. He gave no reason. The less she knew, the better. He couldn't be sure where her loyalties lay. Her departure was the first signal to Finch that something had changed. The doctor called Julian that same afternoon, his voice oozing with false concern. "Julian, I heard you let Helen go. Is everything all right? Is Leo okay?" "We're making some changes," Julian said, his voice a carefully controlled monotone. "I've hired a new private nursing staff." It was a lie, but a necessary one. "I see," Finch said, a slight edge to his voice. Well, I'd strongly advise against any disruption to Leo's routine. He's in a very delicate state, and I must insist on approving any new medical personnel myself. I'll take it under advisement, Julian said, and ended the call. Under Dr. Thorne's guidance, they began the weaning process. Clara became Leo's sole caregiver, a constant, soothing presence. The first few days were brutal. As the dosage of the antipsychotic was minutely reduced, Leo's body began to rebel. He was agitated, his sleep was racked with tremors, and he refused to eat. He would sit in his chair, rocking back and forth, a low, distressed moan coming from his throat. It was heartbreaking to watch. Julian felt his resolve waver. The urge to stop the pain, to go back to the familiar, silent stillness, was immense. But Clara was his rock. "This is the poison leaving him," she would whisper, wiping Leo's brow with a cool cloth. "We have to be strong for him. He's fighting." She never left his side, singing to him for hours, holding his hand, letting him know he wasn't alone in the struggle. Then, on the fourth day, something shifted. A small victory. Leo, in a moment of calm, looked at the wooden horse in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. He turned it over and over, his fingers exploring its familiar shape with a new curiosity. Then he looked at Clara, held it out to her, and let it drop into her open palm. It was an act of complete and total trust. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she closed her hand around the small toy. He was giving her his shield. He was telling her he was ready to face the world without it. Julian watched from the doorway, his own eyes burning. That small wooden horse felt more valuable than his entire corporate empire. But their clandestine progress had not gone unnoticed. Finch, cut off from his patient and his income stream, grew desperate. He must have had other sources inside the house, perhaps a cleaner or a security guard on his payroll, because he knew they were deviating from his protocol. He couldn't risk Julian discovering the truth, so he launched a vicious, preemptive strike. One morning, two stern-faced people in suits arrived at the front door. They were from Child Protective Services. "We've received an anonymous report," the woman said, her eyes cold and assessing, "alleging child endangerment and the practice of medicine without a license." Julian's blood ran cold. It was Finch. Of course, it was Finch. He was using the system as a weapon. They were ushered inside. The investigators saw a large, sterile home, a nonverbal child in a clear state of distress, the withdrawal, and a father who was visibly on edge. And they saw Clara, a housekeeper with no medical credentials, who was now, for all intents and purposes, Leo's primary caregiver. Finch had laid the perfect trap. He had undoubtedly used his authority as Leo's longtime physician to paint a picture of a wealthy, unstable father swayed by the dangerous, pseudo-scientific methods of an unqualified and manipulative employee. The investigator separated them for interviews. Julian tried to explain, but without revealing the full scope of Finch's crimes, which he wasn't ready to do without his legal team present, his story sounded thin. "I have lost faith in his doctor," was all he could say. "We are seeking a second opinion." Clara was questioned in the kitchen. She answered their questions honestly. Yes, she sang to the boy. Yes, she had changed his diet. No, she was not a nurse. The investigators exchanged a look. Her honest admissions were, in the context of the report filed by a respected doctor, damning. The lead investigator delivered the verdict with bureaucratic detachment, pending a full investigation into the allegations made by Dr. Finch. A temporary emergency order is being issued. Ms. Mayhew is to have no contact with the child. She must leave the premises immediately. Julian exploded. "You can't do that. She's the only one he trusts." But his protests were useless. It was a court order. Two police officers who had been waiting outside entered the house. The scene was a nightmare. Clara looked at Julian, her face a mask of anguish. "Don't let him win," she mouthed silently. The hardest part was the separation from Leo. He didn't understand what was happening. He saw the strangers, his father's angry voice, the police uniforms. He saw them leading Clara, his safe harbor, towards the door. A sound tore from his throat, a sound of pure primal terror. It was a scream, raw and agonized. He scrambled from his chair and tried to run to her, his legs clumsy and uncoordinated. One of the officers moved to block him, and Leo collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing with sobs. It was the most emotion anyone had seen from him in years, and it was born of utter devastation. Clara was escorted out, her own tears flowing freely. The heavy front door closed, and the silence that descended was 100 times more profound and painful than before. Leo was inconsolable. He retreated to a corner of the room, curling into a fetal position, his screams subsiding into a heartbreaking, rhythmic whimpering. Julian knelt beside him, trying to comfort him, but his touch was rejected. The small spark of connection that Clara had so patiently nurtured had been brutally extinguished. Julian Vance, the man who could move markets with a single phone call, had never felt so utterly, devastatingly powerless. Finch had not only retaliated, he had ripped out his heart and his hope, and left him alone in the dark with his weeping child. The hours after Clara's removal were the longest of Julian's life. Leo's regression was swift and terrifying. He refused all food and water. The soft hums were replaced by a constant, low moan of distress. He wouldn't let Julian near him, flinching at his touch. He sat in the corner of the living room, his knees drawn to his chest, his body rigid once more, rocking back and forth in a rhythm of pure misery. The house, which had just begun to feel the first stirrings of warmth, was plunged back into a grief-stricken winter. But this time, Julian's grief was not a paralyzing fog, it was a forge. The sight of his son's suffering, the raw injustice of it all, hammered his sorrow into a weapon of tempered steel. The cold, calculating titan of industry, the man he had been before Leo's light went out, was back. But this time, his focus wasn't on a corporate acquisition, it was on annihilation. His first call was to his lawyer, a woman so sharp she could have carved diamonds with her words. "I want that CPS order obliterated," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I want a team of private investigators on the 2 people who were here today. I want to know who they had lunch with, who they talked to, and who signed their paychecks. And I want it all yesterday." His second call was to Dr. Thorne. He explained the situation. Thorne was furious. "He's weaponizing the child's withdrawal symptoms against you. It's diabolical. We need to move faster." Thorne agreed to fly back immediately, bringing 2 trusted pediatric nurses with him. He would officially take over as Leo's physician of record, a move that would provide a powerful counter-narrative to Finch's claims. His third call was to Clara. He had his security team place her in a luxury hotel suite for her comfort and her safety. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "This is my fault. I underestimated him." "It's not your fault," she replied, her voice thick with tears but steady. "It's his. How is Leo?" Julian's voice broke as he described the scene. "He needs you," he said simply. "I'm going to get you back. I swear on my wife's memory, I will burn Alistair Finch to the ground." In that moment, they were no longer employer and employee. They were partners in a war, united by their love for a little boy. For the next 48 hours, Julian Vance unleashed his full arsenal. His legal team filed an emergency appeal armed with a scathing affidavit from Dr. Thorne that detailed Finch's medically egregious and potentially criminal treatment of Leo. His investigators, meanwhile, worked around the clock. They discovered that the anonymous tip to CPS had come from a burner phone, but they traced its purchase to a convenience store 2 blocks from Finch's private clinic. They also uncovered something more damning, a pattern. They found 2 other wealthy families whose children had been treated by Finch for atypical neurological conditions. In both cases, the children had been heavily medicated, isolated from outside medical opinions, and Finch had billed the families exorbitant amounts for his specialized care. One of the families had moved their child to a facility in Switzerland, and the boy had made a miraculous recovery after being taken off Finch's prescribed medications. They had a witness. While the legal and investigative battles raged, Julian focused on his son. Dr. Thorne and his nurses arrived, their calm professionalism a balm in the chaotic house. They managed to get Leo hydrated with an IV and continued the weaning process, adjusting the protocol to manage the severe emotional distress. But Leo remained withdrawn, a ghost of a ghost. He wouldn't even look at Julian. The only thing that seemed to reach him was Clara's voice. Julian would call her and put the phone on speaker, and she would sing their lullaby. During those brief moments, Leo's frantic rocking would still, his moaning would quiet. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread of connection in a sea of despair. The plan for the final confrontation began to take shape. They couldn't rely on a drawn-out legal battle. Leo didn't have that kind of time. They needed to end it quickly. They needed a confession. Julian's security chief, a former intelligence officer, devised the strategy. Julian would request a meeting with Finch at the mansion, under the pretense of capitulation. He would say that Leo's regression had proven Finch right, that he was desperate and needed his help. The entire room, the study where this nightmare had begun to unravel, would be outfitted with state-of-the-art, concealed recording equipment. Dr. Thorne and the lawyer for the other family would be waiting in an adjacent room, ready to enter at the key moment. Julian made the call. "Alistair," he said, injecting a note of weary defeat into his voice, "you were right. I was a fool to listen to that woman. He's worse than ever. I need you. Please, can you come to the house?" He could almost hear the smirk in Finch's voice. "Of course, Julian. I'm always here for you and Leo. I'll be there this afternoon." The trap was set. Julian looked at the live feed of his son, curled up and silent in the corner of his room. The cold fury returned, settling deep in his bones. This wasn't just for justice anymore. It was for the sound of his son's laughter. It was for every stolen smile, every word that had been locked away, every peaceful night's sleep that had been denied. Alistair Finch thought he was coming for a victory lap. He was walking into his own execution. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, carrying his leather medical bag, his face a perfect mask of solemn concern. He looked every bit the distinguished, caring physician. Julian met him in the grand foyer, his own expression carefully schooled into one of haggard desperation. "Thank you for coming, Alistair. I don't know what to do." "It's all right, Julian," Finch said, placing a condescending hand on his shoulder. "You've been under immense strain. It's understandable that you were taken in by a charlatan. We'll get Leo back on track." He exuded an aura of calm authority, the same aura that had fooled Julian and Isabella for years. Julian led him into the study. The trap was invisible. Microphones were hidden in the spines of books. A pinhole camera in the face of the mantelpiece clock. "She's gone, of course," Julian said, gesturing for Finch to sit in one of the leather armchairs. "The authorities were very efficient." "As they should be," Finch said, settling into the chair with a proprietary air. "The damage she's done is significant. We'll need to be aggressive to counteract it. I suggest we immediately reinstate his full dosage, perhaps even increase it slightly to stabilize his system." He was already writing a prescription, the instrument of his crime, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Julian let him talk, let him dig his own grave. He let Finch explain how Clara's emotional theatrics had overstimulated Leo's fragile nervous system, how her kitchen remedies had disrupted his delicate biochemical balance. He listened to the man who had systematically tortured his son lecture him on proper care. The cold fury inside Julian was a living thing, but on the surface he was the picture of a broken, compliant father. "You were right all along," Julian said, his voice heavy with false regret. "Isabella. She had her doubts, you know. Towards the end, she worried about the medication." He was probing, laying the final piece of the snare. Finch's composure tightened for a fraction of a second. "Isabella was emotional," he said dismissively. "Her grief was, as I told you both at the time, clouding her judgment. It's a good thing she had us, you and I, to be objective." The sheer arrogance of it, the desecration of his wife's memory, was almost too much for Julian to bear. But he held on. It was time. "It's funny," Julian said, his tone shifting, losing its desperate edge and gaining a razor-sharp clarity, "because her judgment seems pretty sound to me now." He picked up a remote from the desk and pressed a button. A flat-screen television, concealed behind a painting, slid into view. He pressed another button. It was security footage from that rainy Wednesday. It showed Leo, tilting his head to Clara's song. It showed him making a sound. It showed the tear of release. Finch stared at the screen, his face draining of color. "What is this? Heavily edited footage proves nothing." "And this?" Julian said, pressing the button again. The screen now showed the report from the investigators, the shell corporations, the Delaware lab, the balance sheets showing millions of dollars flowing from the Vance estate into Finch's pockets. Finch shot to his feet. "This is slander. It's libel. My lawyers will—" He was cut off as the door to the study opened. Dr. Uri, Eris Thorne walked in, followed by a man and a woman Julian didn't recognize. "Dr. Finch," Thorne said, his voice cold, "I am Dr. Eris Thorne. I've been reviewing your treatment of Leo Vance. I believe you know the Hamiltons." He gestured to the couple, whose faces were etched with a pain that mirrored Julian's own. "Our son Michael," Mrs. Hamilton said, her voice shaking with rage. "You did the same thing to our son. You told us he was beyond hope. He's in Switzerland now. He's learning to walk again." Finch was cornered. He looked from face to face, his mask of compassion finally cracking to reveal the panicked, greedy man beneath. He lunged for his medical bag. "I'm leaving. This is an illegal ambush." "I don't think so," Julian said. He pressed one final button on his remote. This time it was audio. The clear, beautiful sound of Isabella's voice, taken from an old home video, filled the room. "And he laughed today, Alistair. A real belly laugh. Are you sure this new medicine is necessary?" Finch flinched as if he'd been struck. The sound of the voice he had silenced, the voice of the woman he had betrayed, was his undoing. "She was a fool," he shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "She and her sentimental nonsense. It was a brilliant protocol. It worked perfectly." "It did, didn't it?" Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. "It made you a very rich man." In that moment, two uniformed police officers entered the room, followed by Julian's lawyer. It was over. As they read Finch his rights and cuffed his hands behind his back, he was still babbling, trying to justify himself, a pathetic, broken man stripped of his power and prestige. After he was gone, a profound silence filled the room. Mrs. Hamilton put a hand on Julian's arm. "You got him," she whispered. "For all of them." The CPS order was rescinded that evening. The evidence, the confession, the testimony from Dr. Thorne and the Hamiltons was irrefutable. Julian drove to the hotel himself. When Clara opened the door, he didn't say a word. He just pulled her into a hug, a gesture of profound gratitude and relief. They drove back to the mansion in silence. When they walked through the front door, Leo was in the foyer with Dr. Thorne. He had been watching the door, waiting. He saw Clara. His face, so long a mask of misery, broke into a radiant, beautiful smile. He ran towards her, his steps clumsy but determined. "Clara," he said. It was the first word he had spoken in 3 years. It was quiet, raspy, and the most beautiful sound Julian had ever heard. Clara sank to her knees and caught him in her arms, burying her face in his hair, both of them crying tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The family, broken and scattered, was finally whole again. The 2 years that followed were a time of patient, deliberate healing. The mansion, once a cold monument to grief, was reborn. Julian had the dark, heavy curtains torn down, letting sunlight flood the long, silent rooms. The sterile white walls were repainted in warm, cheerful colors. Leo's vibrant abstract paintings, a form of therapy that had unlocked his creativity, were framed and hung in every hallway. The sound of his laughter, a sound Julian had thought he'd never hear again, became the new soundtrack of their lives. Dr. Alistair Finch was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, reckless endangerment, and aggravated malpractice. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and stripped of his medical license. The Hamiltons and 2 other families Finch had victimized received substantial settlements from a foundation Julian established to combat medical abuse, ensuring the disgraced doctor's crimes would serve a greater purpose. Leo's recovery was a miracle built of small, everyday moments. Under Dr. Thorne's care and with Clara's unwavering patience, he was slowly weaned off the last of the insidious medications. Physical therapy helped him regain the muscle control the drugs had stolen. Speech therapy helped him find the words that had been locked away for so long. There were difficult days, moments of frustration and fear, as he navigated a world of sensation that was still new and sometimes overwhelming. But Clara was always there, his anchor and his guide. She taught him how to skip a stone across the surface of the pool, how to bake his favorite chocolate chip cookies in the now bustling kitchen, and how to read his favorite stories aloud, his small voice growing stronger and more confident with every page. Clara was no longer the housekeeper. The pretense had been dropped within weeks of her return. She was Julian's partner, his confidant, and his equal in every way. The shared trauma had forged a bond between them deeper than any romance could begin to explain. They were survivors who had found in each other a reason to rebuild. She was a mother to Leo in every way that mattered, the one who kissed his scraped knees, who helped him with his homework, and who held him when nightmares of his silent years flickered through his sleep. Julian, for his part, transformed from a ghost in his own home to a present, engaged, and deeply loving father. He learned to leave his work at the office, to cherish the simple, irreplaceable moments of building a block tower or kicking a soccer ball in the backyard. He had been given a second chance at fatherhood, and he treasured it with the fierce gratitude of a man who knows what it is to lose everything. The final piece of the healing puzzle fell into place one cool evening in spring. Clara was tucking a now 7-year-old Leo into his bed. For months he had still been hesitant to lie completely flat, a psychological echo of the vertigo that had plagued him. He slept on his side, curled around a pillow. But tonight, as Clara finished his bedtime story, he wriggled around, stretched his small body out, and settled onto his back with a contented sigh, his head resting squarely on his pillow. He looked up at her, his brown eyes clear and bright. "The spinning stopped a long time ago," he said, with the simple wisdom of a child. Clara's heart swelled. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, her hand lingering in his soft hair. "I know, sweet boy," she whispered. "Sleep well." Julian was standing in the doorway watching them. When Clara came out, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together they stood for a moment, looking at their son. Leo was sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm, a picture of perfect, hard-won tranquility. The boy who had been forced to sleep sitting up, a prisoner in his own body, was finally, truly, at rest. Julian looked at Clara, her quiet strength the foundation upon which their new life was built. He had been one of the richest men in the world, but he had been impoverished in spirit. It took a woman with nothing but her own broken heart and a refusal to look away to show him what true wealth really was. It was in the quiet breathing of a sleeping child, in the warmth of a hand held in the dark. It was the simple, profound truth that the most valuable things in life are not the things we own, but the people we fight to protect. Before we conclude this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that.